Item. Notwithstanding the preponderance of signs pointing toward suicide, which grew more alarming when Hastily the teacher found in the drawer of the immaculate desk not a suicide note, but the 124 pages of the Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis, made available here for the delectation of a broader readership. Unsigned, it's true, and examined each of them with the tweezers of his 24-function Swiss army knife in order not to contaminate the evidence. And yet, in Goschenen on the night of 13 to 14 January, temperature minus 23 degrees Celsius, there was no frozen corpse to be found. People poked staves and threw fishnets in the icy falls of the Rius, hoping, now that bad enough had happened, that worse would not soon follow. A corpse, there is the parallel between suicide and homicide. In both you have a body, a murder weapon, and an alibi. Though, as we know, not least of all from the Tractatus itself, the suicide survivors are the ones who clamour for evidence that will lay the blame elsewhere. In plain words, the motive, we almost failed to say, is an alibi for the mourners. He shot himself because, they say. He hanged himself because. And there they leave it, pleased as Punch once more to have ducked death themselves, for this most revolutionary act a person can commit in his life is frequently contagious. The opening short essay there from Hermann Berger's 1988 Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis on killing oneself. So, as you can imagine, trigger warning before venturing into this book, which, as you know, I'm a fan of Hermann Berger, if you can say such a thing. I'm very intrigued by his work. It's singular, but this is, as per the title, the limit, really, of pessimistic philosophy. Outside of someone who perhaps just quite literally ends their life and makes no statement about it, this is probably the absolute limit of pessimistic philosophy, and everything that is floating around terms such as nihilism and pessimism and all that jazz, which anyone who's been listening to me recently will know that I have moved away from fairly organically. It didn't expect it to happen, but have moved away from. And so now this book holds quite a strange place on my shelves, because the book itself, Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis, on killing oneself, the title, of course, refers to Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. This is a book of 1,046 aphorisms that are related to the sentence gegeben ist der Tod, bitte finden Sie die Lebensrat heraus. Death is given, please find the cause of life. But this is really 1,046 aphorisms by Berger on suicide. It is a book, quite literally, about suicide that was initially viewed by critics with sarcasm, as relating more deeply to Berger's wit and humour, and there is elements of humour in this. But, and I will state this, then read some of the biography. This is translated again by Adrian Nathan West, who in his introduction to this book supplies some biographical information. I will describe this book in 2 words. Actively boring. It's not boring. Certainly not boring. It's not like, it's not quite literally something that you pick up, you read 20 pages over, and your eyes are glossing over because you are bored. Berger, and this is really where the title comes in, The Limits of Pessimism, or the limits of pessimistic philosophy, if you like. Berger, as per a lot of his work, is dealing with boredom in a very serious sense. And so when I say active boredom, he is so deeply involved in the feeling of boredom that it becomes something that you're investigating in itself. And that leads really only to one place for Berger, which is suicide, and that is where it led him. So a couple of excerpts from the introduction from Nathan West. This first one of which is rather controversial, but it's relatively infamous regarding Berger. This is actually from a mixture of Nathan West and Berger's own thing. I mention all of this because it deeply concerned Berger, whose childhood from the outside seems to have been normal, if not idyllic, but who harbored bottomless resentment about the many injustices he allegedly suffered. He blamed his younger siblings for coming after him, claiming, apparently in earnest, that the birth canal was too narrow for him and that he'd had to struggle for air as he passed through it. He blamed his mother's prudery for his impotence and genital migraines. When his wife and children left him after putting up with his manic depression for years, he compared them to rats fleeing a sinking ship. To a friend's rebuke at his drawing an analogy between his bullying at a summer camp and the gas chambers at Auschwitz, he replied that indeed he'd been wrong. It was an inadmissible understatement. What he suffered had been far, far worse. This is evidence, among other things, of the truculence of depression, which at its worst drives one to hurt and offend, to push others away because their presence is a painful reminder of one's basic inability to be with others in a normal way. All this might seem a bit much from a man born into a stable, seemingly loving middle-class family in Switzerland, one of the richest countries in the world. But I would mention here that clinical findings point to disturbances of autobiographical memory and depression, with some even considering depression a memory disorder. And the next excerpt. He was discharged in January 1989 and in a fever state planned radio and TV appearances and readings and met with his new publisher to talk about the upcoming volumes of Brenner, which he intended to be a tetralogy that would rival Proust's Recherche. Anyone familiar with bipolar disorder will recognize the dangers latent in these moments of exuberance. Berger himself did, as he makes clear here in Aphorism 377. The endogenous depressive kills himself not because he is in a bottomless pit. Au contraire, he'd be all too pleased to disappear into one. Instead, he ends it all when he seems to be getting better. Only then does he recognize the full extent of his tragic fate. On 11th of February 1989, he told an interviewer, Death is nearer than ever. 17 days later, he died of an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol. So, what is this? It's a book of 1,046 aphorisms on suicide from a man who lived a relatively privileged life in Switzerland, who was entirely caught up with getting out of the world. He was caught up, as per my review of Diabelli, he was caught up in escape and masks and veils and selves and exit, and Houdini was a big influence on him and what it is to hide away and get out of the world. And ultimately, Berger ended up preferring fantasy and fictions and theatre to reality. He preferred artificial creations to the real world itself in the end. And alongside someone who sort of had a catastrophically self-imposed psychoanalytic, self-determined again, madness of their state of being. He was extremely unwell. But when we look at these aphorisms, and really I could pick any page, I mean, even if I picked one here at random, and this is quite literally at random, the aphorisms are like this. This is 537. Too little life, too much death, so the saying goes. The suicide makes everything of this too much and too little. Or we could flip again to, I don't know, let's go page 51. 248. Not every suicidal opus is contagious. Or 247. No one need die after reading our Tractatus, because the tension of expectation vanishes into nothing, into mortology, which is actually quite apt. That was genuinely random, but mortology is where I sort of want to begin with the thematics of So, of the book. So, of course, they're all around suicide and what it is to kill oneself. Arguably, many of them are actually, the majority of them are attending to suicide in a defense of it, because they're coming from Berger's foundation. That really the results and ending of any serious investigation into life now is one of boredom, is one of just wanting to create an artificiality and escape behind a mask or into some theatre. And now you're just bored, and you're sort of known of this boredom. And this book itself is a testament to this feeling of pessimistic boredom. Actually, the book begins, there is no natural death. But it is aphorism 4, which is somewhat important with regard to Berger's view of death, suicide. Aphorism 4. Mortology is the doctrine and philosophy of the total predominance of death over life. And so mortology is the doctrine and philosophy of the total predominance of death over life. Aphorism 3, suicidology is the science of self-murder. And then when we actually get to the final aphorisms, so aphorism 1046 is finis, Latin, I guess, for, sort of end. But, and then 1045 is quadratum demonstratum. But 1044 is the one that I think is important and sort of is a testament to the circularity of Berger's logic. I die, therefore I am. It is a book of boredom and tautology. Now, when we look at this notion of mortology, of the predominance of death over life, what we're looking at is really a reduction in terms of Berger's thought. In my own opinion, to draw in the work of Michel Serres, but also someone like Wilfrid Sellars, who is dividing the world into these forms of images. For me, what Berger is doing is subsuming many people make this mistake with regard to many outlooks and ideologies that they hold. Berger is subsuming the entirety of existence into a single, let's say, mortological image of the world. And what's mortology doing? It is the scientific image reduction of the human being, death's predominance over life. To me, that is a paradox and an oxymoron and hypocrisy. Death's predominance over life, and yet at the same time, Berger will say that no one ever knows their death. This thing of suicide is the thing that you don't know. No one is really around for their death, and so the predominance of death over life. I will say outright that for me, the one of the primary reasons I'm actually doing this review as someone who's organically, as I said, dissipated and moved away from the majority of people who are into pessimistic philosophy's bleaker than thou masturbatory engagement with pessimistic philosophy is not so much to say don't read the book, because the book is a great artifact of interest and of really, again, that limit of pessimistic philosophy, which I'll get to. But it's one of the reasons for doing the review is actually to say to people that this is ridiculous, this is masturbation, this is silly. And at root, when we become sane for a brief moment, when we're not caught up in abstract philosophy's word games and the limitrophies of what can be done with good prose, great prose, he's a great writer, and poetics and humour, is that Berger is unwell. This is an unwell book, and much of this philosophy is extremely unwell. Lest you be caught up in the intricacies and pub-type Austrian humour of standing around saying how bad life is while still engaging in it. But Berger himself, of course, does he's in the very small camp of pessimistic philosophers who did take their own lives. Another key one, of course, would be Jean Emery, who was an influence for Berger, but also Philipp Meinlander. And, we can say that those three. Someone such as Schopenhauer, the father of pessimistic philosophy, argued against such a thing in terms of the weight of suffering being increased. But back to mortology, the predominance of death over life. Once again, it is a reduction of the human to a level of being that is outside of its experience and is merely a quantified form of its experience. To say that death has a predominance over life is to say that whilst one is drinking the cup of coffee, that I don't know, whatever it is, the chemical composition, the knowledge of the chemical composition has a predominance over the experience of tasting the cup of coffee, which is complete nonsense. Now, it's not to say that it doesn't change things. Of course, death is the reality. We are all going to die. Boo-hoo. To go back to the point with regard to the cup of coffee, the experience of the cup of coffee is a joyous and sensual experience that is its own thing. Yes, the chemical composition supposedly does change how it tastes, but that isn't the experience of the taste itself. And so this reduction of the entirety of experience in this predominance to simply death, which is a single part that at other points Berger hypocritically says that we aren't really around for, to me is just making it transparent that this is an engagement in what I call, and what I've said on the podcast a few other times before, and I've written an essay about, what I call bleaker than thou thought. And for anyone who's seen or watched the Monty Python sketch of Back in My Day, oh, you think things were bad in my day, well, blah blah blah, bleaker than thou thought is very much of this camp, and it's found in those who are interested in pessimistic philosophy. And I fell into this camp for a while, which was searching out the bleakest of the bleak. You know, usually you would begin with Albert Camus, with absurdism, and then it's not really bleak enough, and then you move through to Schopenhauer, move through to Sartre, move through to Meinlander, move through to early Nick Land, move through to Chiron. Finally a lot of people end up with Chiron, and the Chiron is a very key bleaker than thou name that would be thrown out. And then you move through to, say, Ligotti, and then you really start to go in deep, and you go through to Zapfer, another pessimist, and then maybe you'll finally find yourself reading Hermann Berger. And it's this, oh, you think that's bad, you think that's bad, you think that's bad. And what this whole thing can be subsumed into is the conflation that sort of a brute force, blunt admittance that life is bad is conflated with wisdom and knowledge. But all at the same time, externalizing, compartmentalizing, and usually just actively ignoring the beauty, goodness, and vitality, and love, color, and arguably subtle bliss of just existing. Now, of course, it's forgivable, because once the snowball starts rolling in a certain direction, especially the negative direction, it's very easy for that to compound, and especially when you have conflated wisdom and knowledge with just the simple fact of admittance that things are bad, that therefore compounds into this idea that if you can just find how bad life is, then you will have worked something out. Of course, you won't have worked anything out. You are intellectually and academically masturbating, and you need to go outside. You need to step on the lawn. Now, you could say, well, isn't this arguably a kind of fairly coy, flippant dismissal of Berger's work? Not at all. Berger was unwell. That's the simple fact of the matter. And so the danger is in approaching such works, which many people do. I would think of the work of Georges Bataille as well in this camp. I would also think of some Land's book on Thirst for Annihilation. I would also throw in my own early book on Nick Land. There's many books of this kind. Sartre's work. We are hesitant to draw a line and say this isn't a well person. If this was a friend, we would say to them, I think you need to step away for a while and just go for a walk. And that's not to degrade the work. It's not to reduce the work, and especially the prose and the humor. But as per the title, what actually are the limits of pessimistic philosophy? How much pessimistic suffering is going to be enough? Usually there isn't, because you've made the conflation that there is some truth and there is some wisdom with regard to pessimistic philosophy in itself, just admitting that life is bad. Oh, look how much death there is, look how much pain, suffering there is, yada, 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 as if that hasn't been around since, quite literally, in terms of textual evidence, the days of Buddhism, as if that hasn't been around since the Epic of Gilgamesh, with the internal struggle that we're going to die. I mean, arguably, the first full book that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is quite literally about that struggle of what it is to suffer and to try get away from the fact of death. This isn't anything new, and much modern existential talk approaches it as if it is, even whilst at the same time having to admit that we're all going to die, and we've always known that. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. But what, and Berger's intriguing because he is at least not just continuing the conversation, he has got to the point where it does break, which is boredom. That's why I say the book is actively boring, is because Berger is constantly admitting to, like, we're at the end, we're at the end. What do? I just talk about why I should just end my life. So it's a paradoxical, contradictory book about being alive and writing a book, but at the same time, in the weird masturbatory tension of wanting to cease to exist, largely because he's very unwell. And so the end of pessimistic philosophy is either you keep trying to find some deeper. If you've made that conflation, that acceptance of the misery of the world is synonymous with wisdom and truth and knowledge, which it isn't, then you have two options. One of which is to find the next bleakest philosopher. For my money, it probably is either Meinlander or Zapffe, but Zapffe kind of betrays himself by mountain climbing, or it might be Berger as well. You have to keep trying to find a depth for where there wasn't a depth. It's a false depth of sort of, again, to use the word because I think it's apt, a masturbatory darkness. You either keep trying to find that false depth and deepen that false depth, as if one day there's going to be such a depth of honesty regarding suffering. What's going to happen? Nothing's going to break. What breaks is that it dissipates into a neutrality that actually arises as boredom. Berger is bored. He's really bored because he's stepped out of life. He's stepped out of existing into this artificiality and is now documenting it in this way toward it's a book that is just boring. For instance, aphorism 80, page 28, aphorism 87. To the degree that an illusory life expectancy erodes away and issues abruptly into nothing, death is comic, and it is only logical that those of my ilk, upon studying the Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis, which furnishes a scientific basis for my own suicide, should break out in mortological laughter. Now, so he's sort of saying, look, this isn't really doing anything. You're just going to end up laughing at this. But then the one that I think is key, and is key to this boredom, is on page 41. It's aphorism 181. It proceeds instead via tautology. He killed himself because he killed himself. And there's a lot of this in Berger, of not knowing. That's not a profound statement. It's a dumb statement. And it's probably the most that pessimistic philosophy can ever do. Things are bad because they're bad. He killed himself because he killed himself. That's the definition of active boredom. Sounds intriguing. It has that strange dark vitality of pessimistic philosophy. But the longer you look at it, the more you want to say, Berger, you've got so much. Please, get, I don't know the ins and outs of his body. He was clearly very, very unwell. It was viewed by critics as if it was a sarcastic book. But this bleaker than thou form, and I say it about this book in particular because this is Endgame. A shelf full of pessimistic philosophy. What are you doing? You're bolstering your own misery. You're continuing a line of thought that makes you miserable. And so in that sense, the inversion is that the misery becomes entertainment, that pessimistic philosophy becomes an enjoyment, and arguably that folds, as most dualities do. Pessimism is an optimism. The deepening of this a sincere engagement with this as anything other than an unwell book written by an unwell man, is enjoyment, is an optimism, is an aggrandizement of the unconscious acceptance that the deepening of the philosophically pessimistic rabbit hole is really one's entertainment, is really one's enjoyment. And I've been in that rabbit hole, so I think this little sort of review, and if I was to give it the normal review, it's if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's up there with Chiron. He mentions Chiron. There's a lot of citations of pessimistic philosophers, some very, very obscure. It's up there with Chiron. It's up there with the aphorisms of Schopenhauer, etc. Okay, it has that feeling of I'm in the deep, dark, dirty well of pessimism, and no one else really knows how bad things are. It has that if you want that, but when's it going to be enough? When are you going to be done? Life's bad. All right, great. And so, like so many philosophically pessimistic works, it does betray itself by trying to engage really with humor, and talk about these things in this way. Look how honest I'm being about, the subtitle is on killing oneself. Okay, the limits of pessimistic philosophy: boredom and cringe. And maybe this review isn't really to deter people from reading Berger, because Berger is Diabelli and Brenner are fantastic. And I've reviewed Diabelli, and I've recorded the interview with Adrian Nathan West, the translator of much of Berger's work. And so check them out. He is a fantastic writer. But where are you when you're reading Berger? And where are you especially when you're reading this Tractatus? I know who's reading this. I know who's like intrigued that I've done a review, and so I don't want to be the guy who's saying like this is like the next level of misery. There isn't. They all fold into the same conflation that just because you've seen the corpse of a baby bird on the floor and admitted to it when everyone else is ignoring it, you've conflated that with wisdom, which would be the exact same on the inverse of the same sort of ridiculous happiness where one says, just watch the birds flying in the sky. We're talking about that those are dualities, and you're caught in one side of a duality, which is really just the same thing as the other side. You're just enjoying yourself. These pessimistic philosophy is largely just a masturbation session where if you really sit back and think, what more do I actually know about the world? Has this deepened my experiential engagement with the world? Has this deepened my, if you're really into abstract philosophy, has this deepened my understanding of ontology or epistemology? Very rarely. It's because pessimism usually falls into the camp of sidling up with poetry and aesthetics. You usually don't realize that you're being taken for a bit of an aesthetic ride that is synonymous with that sort of, oh, it's really gritty and real and serious because of it. But no, it falls flat. And but active boredom is the end of philosophical pessimism. And if you're the kind of person who is reading this book, and I think I do know the type who's reading this book, that's where you end up. You end up bored because the conflation you have made won't allow anything in. It's an extremely dampened, suffocated, closed off position that is self-congratulatory. Congratulations, you're miserable. Well done. Do the continual bolstering of this position, the continual reading of the exact same thing but of a different stripe, is that truth? Is that really truth to do that? I don't think so, and I've been through the gauntlet on that one. But It is funny. It is a funny book taken within its context. Berger has a ridiculousness and an intrigue about him. His touchstones are so strange that you are thrown into a new world, a new way of seeing the world. The touchstones, again, like the Diabelli review of escapism and masks and Houdini as an influence, and strange psychoanalytic fixations and humor so black that it's becomes something else altogether, that it's just no longer humorous. Like black humor turned up to a degree that it's not funny anymore. And yeah, I can't see how those who saw it just with sarcasm, because it takes a while to read. You can't just read this straight through. You read about 10 pages of aphorisms and you're exhausted, and the humor runs out. The jokes run dry. The jokes aren't even pointing to anything anymore. You know, Freud would say that a joke, it's the great darkness of Hermann Berger is that Freud would say that a joke hides the truth, and Berger always plays around with this strange cyclicity in that his jokes reveal the truth that there is no hidden truth. His jokes pull off the mask to the fact that there's nothing behind the mask. And that very quickly runs dry, along with Berger's, and you'll see in my readings, it's not bad prose. He's a very intriguing stylist, but it's like if you're trying to find beauty in an engine starting badly, all these commas and weird run-on sentences and jolts and like you can't keep up and you feel a bit like sick. And all of a sudden you're in Berger's sort of demented, strange, escapist, artificial world where, yeah, all you do want to do is smoke cigars and disappear into a plume of smoke and strike out these absurdisms that he says about his life. It's not an engagement, and it's not true, and it's not real, and it's actively boring, like I said. But that's not to say that the book is boring. I hope you understand that. Think of something like a Dark Vitality or a depth absurdism just mutated into this absolute abortion. It's a grey endgame teleology of a certain type of modern person. Do you want to see where that path leads you? Sit down, read this, see how you feel at the end. Is that where you want to be? Is that really true? But again, it's published by Wakefield, who are publishing really great stuff. Translated by Adrian Nathan West. And for those, all of that aside, for those that are interested in those books of history that are so obscure and strange that they've even been written, and the weird and the even macabre, we could say, mortologically macabre. No one does it better. No one does it better than Berger, right? And I really do, another reason for this is I do want more of his stuff. I want it to become more popular, so the more of it gets translated into English. But do or don't read it. It's my strange. I mean, if you're the kind of person who's going to read it, you're the kind of person who's going to read it. So, yeah. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Hermann Berger's Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis, on killing oneself. Yeah. Yeah.